When successful black CEO Langston Reed visits the small town of Millbrook for business, he becomes the target of a corrupt and racist sheriff, Sheriff Grayson, and his allies. What starts as a routine trip spirals into an infuriating ordeal of racial profiling, public humiliation, and false accusations designed to break Langston's resolve. Faced with systemic racism and a town complicit in silence, Langston refuses to be intimidated. As the tension escalates, the depths of the town's corruption and prejudice are laid bare, leaving viewers outraged at the injustice and desperate to see if Langston can fight back. At least, that's how it felt. 15 years old, sharp-witted, and carrying a quiet confidence most people overlooked, Amara moved through life like a shadow. Always there, but rarely seen. She didn't mind it. Most of the time, being invisible was better than being mocked or misunderstood. It was safer. On this particular afternoon, Amara sat on the bench by Willow Creek, a small pond tucked away behind her school. Her backpack rested beside her, its zipper half open, revealing the edge of her sketchbook. She didn't care for crowded hallways or noisy lunchrooms. This was her escape. The quiet hum of nature, the gentle ripple of water, the whispers of wind weaving through the reeds. Her hands moved rhythmically, pencil scratching against paper as she sketched the scene before her. A cluster of ducks gliding across the pond, their movements effortless and serene. Drawing was Amara's sanctuary. It was the one place where the world made sense, where she could control every line and shade, every detail brought to life on her terms. She had just started shading the reflection of the willow branches when she heard it. The sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, breaking the peace like stones hurled into still water. Amara's heart sank. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "Look who's hiding out here again," a voice drawled, dripping with mockery. Dean Cooper, tall, broad-shouldered, and perpetually flanked by his two loyal sidekicks, Marcus and Luke together, they were like a storm cloud that followed Amara wherever she went, loud, menacing, and impossible to ignore. Amara didn't respond. She kept her eyes on her sketch, hoping they'd get bored and move on. It was a strategy that worked sometimes, not always. "Is that what you do all day? Sit here drawing dumb pictures?" Dean sneered. Marcus snickered. "Maybe she's drawing us." "You think we're famous now, Amara?" Luke joined in, his voice louder than necessary. "Hey, we should sign her sketchbook. Maybe she'll sell it when we're rich and famous." Amara gripped her pencil tighter, the tip pressing harder against the paper. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, but she wouldn't look at them, wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Dean wasn't one to be ignored. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her sketch pad. "Let me see." Before Amara could react, Dean's hand shot out, snatching the sketchbook from her lap. "Hey!" she cried, her voice sharper than she intended. Dean flipped through the pages carelessly, his mouth curling into a smirk. "What is this? Art for babies?" Amara's stomach twisted as she watched him thumb through weeks, months, of her work. Each page was a piece of her, a window into the part of herself she never shared with anyone. Seeing him hold it, mock it, felt like someone had cracked her open and was rooting through her insides. "Give it back," she said, her voice low but firm. Dean ignored her. "You know, maybe you should draw something useful for once, like how to make friends." Marcus laughed loudly at that. "Or a map to the real world." Amara clenched her fists, the anger bubbling up inside her. She wanted to scream at them, to snatch the sketchbook back and tell them exactly what she thought of their cruelty. But she knew better. Dean loved getting a rise out of people. It only made him bolder. "Please," Amara said, her voice quieter now. "Just give it back." Dean paused, tilting his head as if considering it. For a moment, Amara thought he might actually listen, but then, with a smug grin, he tossed the sketchbook into the pond. Time seemed to slow as Amara watched it fly through the air, landing with a splash that echoed through the clearing. The pages, so carefully drawn, began to darken as the water swallowed them, ink smudging and running like tears. Dean laughed. "Whoops!" The sound of their laughter, sharp, cruel, deafening, surrounded her. Amara's chest tightened, her vision blurring as tears stung her eyes. But she didn't cry, she wouldn't cry. Instead, she stood up, her hands trembling as she stared at the ripples spreading across the pond. Her sketchbook was gone. Ruined. Dean and his friends were still laughing, but their voices began to fade as Amara tuned them out. She took a deep breath, swallowing the anger, the hurt, the unfairness of it all. And then, slowly, she turned to face them. Dean's laughter faltered when he saw her expression. Steady, unyielding, with a fire behind her eyes he hadn't expected. "You think you're funny?" Amara said quietly, her voice calm, but cutting. Dean blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "I said," Amara continued, stepping closer. "Do you think ruining someone's hard work makes you funny? Or does it just make you small?" The clearing fell silent. For the first time, Dean had nothing to say. At 42 years old, Langston was the CEO of a thriving technology firm that had transformed dozens of small businesses into household names. He owned properties across 3 states, sat on multiple boards, and was featured on Forbes' top black entrepreneurs list 2 years in a row. Yet, despite the wealth, the prestige, and the accolades, you wouldn't know it by looking at him. Langston didn't dress to impress. Today, like most days, he wore a pair of dark jeans and a fitted black turtleneck under a simple gray blazer. His wardrobe was intentional, elegant but unassuming, designed to blend in. He'd learned long ago that being a wealthy black man in America often meant walking a tightrope. Flash too much, and you're arrogant. Show too little, and you're questioned. Either way, the world found a reason to pick you apart. He preferred to keep things simple. Humble. That's why, on a sunny Friday afternoon, Langston found himself sitting alone in a small-town diner on the edge of Millbrook, a place that hadn't changed much since the early 90s. The diner was modest, worn checkered floors, a row of booths along the windows, and a long counter lined with chrome stools that squeaked when you sat on them. The walls were decorated with faded photos of the town's high school sports teams, alongside rusted signs that read things like, "Home is where the heart is," and "Coffee solves everything." The smell of fried bacon and stale coffee hung in the air, grounding the place in its own small-town charm. Langston stirred his coffee absently, watching the people around him. The diner was full of regulars, truckers hunched over stacks of pancakes, retirees murmuring about politics, and a few young families corralling sticky-handed toddlers. A woman in a faded blue apron wove between tables, balancing plates of greasy food, and shouting orders back toward the kitchen. Langston kept his focus on his coffee, trying to ignore the stares he'd felt them the moment he walked through the door, glances that lingered just a second too long. It wasn't outright hostility, it rarely ever was. But the tension was there, humming just beneath the surface. He'd come to Millbrook for business, nothing unusual, a meeting with the town's Chamber of Commerce about funding for a youth mentorship program. It wasn't part of his company's core mission, but Langston always made time for causes that mattered. He believed success was worthless unless you used it to pull others up. He had arrived early, intending to grab lunch and go over his notes. That's when he found the diner, an unassuming old-school spot that looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades. It reminded him of the places his mother used to take him growing up, back when a few crumpled dollars could buy a meal and a moment of peace. "More coffee?" The waitress's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She was an older woman with a kind face and graying hair pulled back in a ponytail. The name tag on her apron said, May. "Sure," Langston replied, offering her a polite smile. May poured the coffee with steady hands, glancing at him with quiet curiosity. "Haven't seen you round here before, you just passing through?" "Something like that," he said, keeping his tone light. "Business meeting this afternoon." "Must be important, you all dressed up like that," May said with a chuckle. Langston smiled. "Just a habit my mama used to say, you should always look like you belong in the room, no matter where you are." "That's good advice," May nodded, giving him an approving look, before shuffling off to the next table. Langston appreciated her warmth, but it didn't ease the tightness in his chest. He could still feel eyes on him, eyes that darted away when he looked up. The corner booth near the door, in particular, drew his attention. 4 men sat there, their voices low, but their gazes pointed. One of them, a middle-aged man with a ruddy complexion and a ball cap that read, USA, locked eyes with Langston for a second too long. He whispered something to the man beside him, and they both snorted with laughter. Langston sighed quietly, gripping the handle of his mug. He knew that look. He'd seen it before. He saw it every time he walked into a room where people didn't think he belonged. It was the look of someone trying to place you, to categorize you, strip you down, and make sense of you. A wealthy black man didn't fit into the neat little boxes they were used to, and that unsettled them. Langston had learned to pick his battles. He'd spent his life turning other people's doubt into fuel. But today, for some reason, the weight of it pressed against him like an old ache that never really went away. A sharp clang broke his thoughts. The man in the ball cap had dropped his fork onto his plate, loud enough to make heads turn. "May," he called, waving the waitress over. "You got yourself some fancy clientele today." The comment was flippant, but Langston didn't miss the edge in his voice. May looked up from the counter, frowning slightly. "What are you talking about, Earl?" Earl jerked his thumb toward Langston without bothering to lower his voice. "That guy over there looks like he's lost." The tension in the room thickened. Langston could feel it spreading, like a ripple moving outward from Earl's table. A few people turned to glance his way, their expressions unreadable. Others stared at their plates, pretending not to notice. May's mouth tightened. "He's a customer, same as anyone else," Earl snorted, leaning back in his seat. "Didn't know we were getting so upscale." Langston's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to keep his expression calm. He'd been here before. He knew better than to react. May's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Earl, if you're fixing to make trouble, you can take it outside." Earl held up his hands in mock surrender. "Hey now, I didn't mean nothing by it, just making conversation." "Then have your conversation somewhere else," May shot back, her tone sharp. The diner fell silent. For a moment, all Langston could hear was the low hum of the ceiling fan overhead and the distant hiss of the griddle in the kitchen. He felt the heat of Earl's stare, even as the man turned back to his meal, muttering something under his breath. Langston exhaled slowly, his grip on the coffee mug loosening. He glanced up at May, who gave him a small, apologetic nod. "You let me know if you need anything else," she said gently, before shuffling away. Langston watched her go, something heavy settling in his chest. May's kindness was genuine, but it didn't erase what had just happened. He looked back at the men in the corner. Earl was hunched over his plate again, shoveling food into his mouth as if nothing had happened. The others were laughing quietly, their voices low but pointed. Langston didn't need to hear the words to know what they were saying. It always started small, sideways comments, whispered jokes, lingering stares, little cracks that hinted at something deeper, something uglier. Langston had spent years learning how to navigate spaces like this, but today, the weight of it settled differently. The truth was, Millbrook wasn't unique. This diner, this moment, it could have been anywhere. It could have been yesterday. It could have been 20 years ago. Langston took a sip of his coffee, staring out the window at the sunlight bouncing off the pavement. He thought about the meeting he had that afternoon, about the mentorship program he was here to fund. And for the first time in a long time, Langston wondered if they'd even let him in the room. This section introduces Langston Reed, his humility, and the subtle challenges he faces in a setting that disregards his authority and identity. It sets the foundation for conflict, while immersing the audience in vivid descriptions and unspoken tension. After May's sharp words cut through the diner's tension, Langston thought it best to finish his coffee, pay his tab, and slip out without further incident. He'd spent a lifetime knowing when to stay and when to go, and Millbrook didn't seem like the kind of place where his presence would be welcomed for long. But fate, as always, had other plans. As Langston stood, reaching for his wallet, the door to the diner swung open with a jingle of bells, followed by the sound of boots stomping against tile. Two men in tan sheriff uniforms walked in, their presence heavy and authoritative. "Afternoon, May," one of them called, nodding toward the counter. Langston didn't recognize the officers, but then again, he didn't have to. Small towns like Millbrook always seemed to produce the same kind of men. Stern, confident in their authority, and suspicious of outsiders. Langston watched them out of the corner of his eye as he slid a couple of bills onto the table. He wasn't looking for trouble, he was just about to leave. But trouble had already found him. The officer who had greeted May, a broad-shouldered man with a buzzed haircut and a silver badge that read Sheriff Grayson, turned to look at Langston, as if sensing his intent to escape unnoticed. His gaze lingered, narrowing slightly. "You lost?" Grayson asked, his tone casual but pointed. Langston looked up slowly, meeting the man's stare with practiced calm. "No, sir, just finishing my coffee." Grayson stepped forward, his boots clicking against the floor, and the second officer, a younger man with a narrow face and sharp eyes, followed close behind. "You're not from around here," Grayson said, his voice carrying across the diner. It wasn't a question. Langston stayed still, his posture relaxed but deliberate. He'd learned that men like Grayson didn't respond well to defiance, nor did they appreciate submission. The trick was to stand your ground without seeming like you were trying to. "No, I'm not," Langston replied evenly. "I'm here on business." Grayson's eyes flickered over Langston's clothes, the tailored blazer, the well-pressed jeans, the polished leather shoes that didn't quite fit with the diner's scuffed-up floors. It was a look Langston recognized. It wasn't curiosity, it was suspicion. "What kind of business?" Langston offered a faint smile. "That's my business." The sheriff's jaw tightened, his posture stiffening slightly. A murmur rippled through the diner, as customers turned in their seats to watch Earl and his friends were still at their booth near the door, smirking as if they'd just lit the match that started a fire. "Now, I'm just trying to do my job here, mister," Grayson said, his voice taking on an edge. "We don't get many folks dressed like you around here, so you'll forgive me for asking questions." Langston let out a slow breath, keeping his voice measured. "I don't think you'd ask those questions if I looked a little more like you." The diner fell silent. For a moment, the sheriff froze, his lips curling into a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "What did you just say?" Langston met his gaze head-on. "I said, you wouldn't be asking me about my business if I looked different, if I looked like the men sitting over there." He nodded subtly toward Earl's table. The younger officer shifted, his hand brushing against his belt. Close to his radio, Langston noted. Grayson's face reddened slightly, but his tone remained icy. "Watch your tone, son. You're starting to sound awful defensive." "I'm not being defensive," Langston said, his voice calm. "I'm answering your question, Sheriff." For a moment, they stared at each other, the air between them humming with tension. Langston could feel the weight of every eye in the diner pressing down on him, waiting for the inevitable. He'd played this scene out before, with different faces and different uniforms, but the outcome was always the same. The officer behind Grayson finally spoke, his voice sharp and clipped. "We're gonna need to see some ID, sir." Langston's fingers curled around the back of the chair he'd been sitting in. Stay calm, stay professional. He'd built his entire career on those principles, on proving himself in boardrooms full of people who doubted him the second he walked in. But here, standing under the scrutiny of these men, it didn't feel like enough. "Is there a reason you're asking for my ID?" Langston asked carefully. "You're making folks uncomfortable," Grayson replied, jerking his chin toward Earl's table. "We've had a couple of incidents lately, out-of-towners causing trouble, just want to make sure you're not one of them." Langston's stomach churned at the words. He wasn't a fool. He knew exactly what this was. Earl had whispered something, pointed a finger, and now Grayson and his deputy had shown up to put Langston back in his place. Langston slipped his wallet from his pocket and pulled out his ID, handing it to Grayson. He could feel the sheriff's smug satisfaction as he snatched it away, squinting at the name and address printed neatly on the card. "Langston Reed," Grayson read aloud, as if the name didn't belong to him. "From Atlanta, huh? That's a long way from Millbrook." "I travel for work," Langston replied, his voice clipped. Grayson handed the ID to the younger officer. "Run this," he said. The deputy stepped back, pulling out a small radio and muttering Langston's information into it. Langston resisted the urge to roll his shoulders, to fidget or pace, anything that might suggest nervousness. He wasn't nervous, he was angry. As they waited, the diner seemed to shrink around him. Earl and his friends watched openly, smug grins plastered across their faces. The young family in the corner huddled together, the mother whispering something to her husband. Even May, who had defended him earlier, now stood behind the counter, her face pale and uncertain. Langston's gaze drifted to the window, where the sun still shone bright and oblivious on the quiet streets outside. This was what it meant to be a black man in America, even in 2024. A man who'd built a career, who'd earned his seat at every table he sat at, but who could still be reduced to suspicious with just one word from the wrong person. The radio crackled, breaking the silence. The deputy's voice came back calm and disinterested. Nothing on him, clean record. Grayson's expression faltered for a split second before he masked it with a thin smile. He handed Langston's ID back with a pointed look. "Well, looks like you're clear," Grayson said, as if it were a favor. "Sorry to bother you, Mr. Reed. Enjoy the rest of your day." Langston took the ID, slipping it back into his wallet without a word. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his frustrations simmering just beneath the surface. He wanted to say something, to call Grayson out for what he'd just done, for the way he'd tried to humiliate him. But Langston knew better. This wasn't about Grayson. It wasn't about Earl. It was about something bigger, something Langston had spent his whole life fighting against. Without another word, Langston turned and walked to the door. He felt the weight of every gaze on his back as he pushed it open, the bell jingling like a final insult. The sunlight outside hit him hard, too bright after the dim stillness of the diner. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing in the clean, cool air, trying to steady himself. "Mr. Reed?" Langston turned to see May standing just inside the doorway, her expression soft and apologetic. She glanced over her shoulder, as if making sure no one else was listening, before meeting his eyes. "I'm real sorry about all that," she said quietly. They don't mean nothing by it." Langston's jaw tightened, but he offered her a faint smile. "They mean everything by it." May winced, looking down at her hands. Langston didn't blame her. She wasn't the problem. "Take care, May," he said, his tone gentler now. He turned and walked toward his car, his steps steady, but his mind racing. The meeting that afternoon suddenly felt heavier, more important, because this wasn't just about funding a youth program. It was about Millbrook, about towns like it, and about making sure that the kids who grew up here saw something different, something better. Langston climbed into his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. As he pulled away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. Through the diner's window, he could see Earl and his friends still sitting there, laughing like they'd won something. But Langston wasn't finished. Not yet. Langston's car cruised down the narrow, sunlit streets of Millbrook, but his thoughts were miles away. The encounter at the diner lingered, gnawing at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. Earl, Sheriff Grayson. Men like them weren't new. He'd been dealing with their kind his entire life. But there was something about this town that unsettled him deeper than usual, as if the tension here wasn't just personal, but institutional, buried beneath polite smiles and rusted home sweet home signs. The meeting with the Chamber of Commerce was scheduled to take place at the town's courthouse, an old brick building at the center of Millbrook. Langston parked his car and walked up the wide stone steps, his shoes echoing against the silence of the empty square. Inside, the courthouse felt frozen in time. The walls were lined with faded portraits of former judges, all white men, staring down with solemn expressions. The wooden benches in the main hall were worn smooth, and a faint smell of varnish mixed with old paper lingered in the air. Langston was early. The meeting wasn't for another 15 minutes, so he approached the receptionist, a gray-haired woman perched behind a tall mahogany desk. Her nameplate read, "Mrs. Sutton." "Good afternoon," Langston said, offering a warm smile. "I'm here for the Chamber of Commerce meeting, Langston Reed." Mrs. Sutton didn't return the smile. She peered up at him over her half-moon glasses, her expression unreadable. "Meeting?" "Yes, the mentorship funding program," Langston explained. "I believe Mr. Mitchell invited me." Her lips pursed tightly, as if she'd tasted something sour. "There must be a mistake. I don't have you on the schedule." Langston blinked, caught off guard. "I confirmed with Mr. Mitchell just yesterday." Mrs. Sutton didn't respond right away. Instead, she reached for the phone beside her, her movements slow and deliberate. Langston felt his patience thinning, though he masked it well. "I'll call someone," she said finally. "You can sit over there." Langston nodded and turned toward the row of benches. He chose the one closest to the door, lowering himself carefully onto the hard wood. Minutes passed. Long, uncomfortable minutes. Langston checked his watch. 10 minutes until the meeting started. He was beginning to think Mrs. Sutton had forgotten about him when the front door creaked open. Two men strode into the courthouse. Langston recognized the first man immediately: Sheriff Grayson. His partner from the diner was with him, still wearing that smug expression that Langston already loathed. "What brings you here, Sheriff?" Mrs. Sutton asked. Grayson jerked his thumb toward Langston, his voice loud enough to carry through the hall. "Just need a word with Mr. Reed here." Langston's stomach tightened, but he kept his expression calm. "What now?" "Mr. Reed," Grayson said, stepping forward, his voice thick with false politeness. "Mind coming with us for a minute?" Langston stayed seated. "Is there a problem, Sheriff?" "Just need to clear a few things up," Grayson replied, his tone shifting. The fake friendliness was gone, replaced by an edge of authority that brooked no argument. "Won't take long." Langston looked at Mrs. Sutton, who was watching with thinly veiled curiosity. The receptionist had heard the exchange, but said nothing, complicit in silence. "I'd like to know what this is about," Langston said evenly, standing up. "I have a meeting with Mr. Mitchell shortly." Grayson stepped closer, his presence deliberate, his broad frame blocking Langston's path. "You can talk to Mitchell after, let's go." The second officer, Deputy Collins, Langston remembered, hovered near the door like a sentry, his hand resting on his belt. Just a little too casually, Langston's pulse quickened, though outwardly he remained composed. "You have no right to detain me," Langston said firmly. "If you're not charging me with something." Grayson's face darkened. "We're not detaining you, Mr. Reed, we're asking questions. Now either you come with us, or we'll start to wonder what you're hiding." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Langston glanced around the courthouse, taking in the empty hall, the silent receptionist, the weight of two officers staring him down. He knew this game. They wanted him to resist. They wanted him to snap, to give them a reason to escalate. "Fine," Langston said, his voice cold. "Let's get this over with." They led Langston into a small, dimly lit room in the courthouse basement. It looked like an interrogation room straight out of a procedural drama. Gray walls, a metal table, two mismatched chairs. Langston sat down, placing his hands deliberately on the table, palms open, calm, controlled, unthreatening. Grayson leaned against the wall, while Deputy Collins paced the room, circling Langston like a predator sizing up prey. "Mind explaining what this is about?" Langston asked. Grayson smirked. "You're not in Atlanta anymore, Mr. Reed. Around here, we don't take kindly to strangers stirring up trouble." Langston's jaw tightened. "I haven't stirred up anything." "Depends who you ask," Grayson replied. "Couple of folks mentioned a man matching your description causing a disturbance at the diner earlier." Langston's stomach dropped. "Of course. That's not what happened," Langston said coolly. "I had coffee, I paid my bill. The only disturbance came from the men harassing me while I sat there." Grayson pushed off the wall, stepping closer. "That's so, 'cause witnesses tell a different story. Big city man mouthing off, acting like he owns the place. Sounds to me like you were looking for trouble." Langston stared at him, disbelief simmering beneath the surface. "I'm here on business," he said slowly. "Mr. Mitchell and the Chamber of Commerce invited me to discuss a youth program. Check with him if you don't believe me." "We will," Collins cut in. "But right now, you're making yourself look mighty suspicious." Langston exhaled sharply, forcing down the frustration rising in his chest. "You have my identification. You know exactly who I am." "Maybe," Grayson said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But a man with money and a slick name doesn't mean he's clean. People lie all the time." Langston's fists clenched beneath the table. "Calm, stay calm." "You can't intimidate me," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "I know my rights. If you're not charging me with something, I'll be leaving." Grayson's smirk faltered. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension suffocating. Then Collins stepped forward, placing both hands on the table and leaning in close. "Why don't you tell us what you're really doing here?" he said, his voice sharp. "Folks like you don't just wander into Millbrook for no reason. Who are you working with?" Langston's eyes narrowed. "What are you accusing me of?" Grayson crossed his arms, his smirk returning. "Nothing yet, but people like you always slip up eventually." Langston pushed back his chair, rising to his full height. "This is over, I won't sit here while you throw around baseless accusations. Call Mr. Mitchell if you want confirmation." Before Grayson could respond, a voice echoed from the hallway outside the room. "Grayson, what the hell is this?" Langston froze, recognizing the voice immediately. Seconds later, the door burst open, and Mitchell Carter, the head of the Millbrook Chamber of Commerce, stepped inside, a tall, silver-haired man in his 60s. Mitchell carried himself with authority. Grayson turned, his expression caught somewhere between surprise and irritation. "We're just asking questions." "Questions?" Mitchell cut him off, his tone sharp. "To Langston Reed, are you out of your damn mind?" Langston's chest loosened slightly as Mitchell turned to him, extending a hand. "Mr. Reed, my sincerest apologies. This is unacceptable." Langston shook his hand, his grip firm but controlled. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. I'm glad someone's willing to be reasonable." Mitchell turned back to Grayson, his face hard. "Sheriff, this man is a guest of the Chamber of Commerce, a personal guest. You'll release him immediately, and I'll be expecting an explanation for this nonsense later." Grayson's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Collins shifted awkwardly, suddenly avoiding Langston's gaze. "Let's go, Mr. Reed," Mitchell said, gesturing for Langston to follow. As Langston stepped past Grayson, he didn't miss the look in the sheriff's eyes, a look that promised this wasn't over. And for the first time in hours, Langston smiled faintly. "Let it come." Langston stepped out of the courthouse alongside Mitchell Carter, the heavy oak doors groaning shut behind them. The late afternoon sun was no longer comforting. Instead, it beat down on him like a spotlight, exposing every emotion he was fighting to contain. "I'm so sorry, Langston," Mitchell said for the third time, shaking his head in disbelief. "I had no idea Grayson would pull something like that. It's unacceptable." Langston turned to him, his expression calm, but his voice edged with steel. "You didn't know, but it doesn't surprise me. Sheriff Grayson didn't start acting like this yesterday, Mitchell. He just got comfortable enough to stop hiding it." Mitchell opened his mouth to respond, but faltered. Langston noticed the hesitation, a subtle pullback, like Mitchell was wrestling with how far he could go without rocking the boat. "What are you going to do about it?" Langston asked, his eyes narrowing. Mitchell let out a slow breath. "Langston, this town is complicated. Grayson's got a lot of people on his side, whether I like it or not. Calling him out, publicly, I'm not sure it'll solve much." "Not solve much?" Langston's voice sharpened, frustration bubbling up. "That man dragged me into a room, threatened me, and tried to humiliate me on nothing more than a hunch because of the color of my skin. And you want me to sit quietly and move on?" "I didn't say that," Mitchell said quickly, holding up a hand. "But we have to be careful. If you go after Grayson, he'll come after you twice as hard. That's just who he is, and he's not above bending the rules to get his way." Langston's jaw tightened, his pulse pounding in his ears. Then maybe it's time someone reminded him that his way doesn't fly anymore. Before Mitchell could respond, the sound of tires screeching against pavement cut through the air. Both men turned toward the courthouse steps as two squad cars pulled up, their lights flashing, but sirens silent. What now? The doors swung open, and out stepped Sheriff Grayson, his expression hard and vindictive. Behind him trailed Deputy Collins, a smug smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Langston's fists curled instinctively at his sides. He knew this wasn't over. He'd seen it in Grayson's eyes before they left that interrogation room. But this was faster and bolder than he'd expected. "Mr. Reed!" Grayson called, his voice booming across the quiet square. People were beginning to gather now, business owners peering out of shop windows, passers-by stopping mid-stride to see what was happening. Langston stood his ground, shoulders squared. "What is it now, Sheriff?" Grayson stepped forward, holding up a small folded piece of paper. "You're under arrest." The words hit Langston like a slap. "On what charge?" Grayson's smile was slow and cruel. "Fraud and trespassing." Langston barked out a disbelieving laugh. "Fraud, trespassing, are you serious?" "Dead serious," Grayson replied, handing the paper to Collins, who stepped forward, handcuffs gleaming at his hip. "We received an anonymous tip that you've been misrepresenting yourself, showing up here claiming to be a businessman with official meetings when no such record exists." Langston glanced at Mitchell, who looked stunned. "Tell him, Mitchell. Tell him about the meeting, Mitchell stammered, stepping forward. This is ridiculous. Grayson Langston is here for a Chamber of Commerce meeting, he's my guest. Grayson turned to Mitchell, his eyes cold. Then maybe you can explain why there's no record of that meeting on the courthouse schedule. Mrs. Sutton checked. Nothing. Mitchell's mouth opened and closed, his confidence cracking. That can't be right, Langston's stomach twisted. He could see what was happening. Grayson had orchestrated this, likely with the help of Mrs. Sutton and Earl's whisper campaign. And now, he was spinning a narrative that Langston was an imposter, a criminal. Collins stepped closer, his hand grazing the cuffs. Hands behind your back, Mr. Reed. Langston didn't move. He stood tall, his voice low and deadly calm. You have nothing, you know it? And I know it, Grayson smirked. Then come down to the station and prove it. If you're clean, you've got nothing to worry about. Langston's heart pounded in his chest as the crowd began to murmur. He felt the weight of their stares pressing in on him. Some of them looked curious. Others looked concerned, but he could see it in their faces, the seed of doubt being planted. That's how men like Grayson worked. They didn't need facts. All they needed was a whisper of suspicion to turn someone into an enemy. Langston, Mitchell said quietly, his voice trembling. Maybe you should just… Langston cut him off with a sharp look. No, I'm not playing into this. But before he could say more, Collins lunged forward, grabbing Langston's arm. The deputy's grip was rough, his hand clamping down hard on Langston's wrist. Let go of me, Langston snapped, pulling back, his composure fracturing. Resisting arrest? Grayson said loudly, his voice echoing across the square. That's a bad look, Mr. Reed. Collins yanked Langston's arm behind his back, the metal cuffs biting into his skin with a harsh click. Langston gritted his teeth, rage flaring white-hot in his chest. Sheriff, this is insane, Mitchell shouted, his voice panicked. You're making a mistake. Grayson ignored him, his gaze fixed on Langston. You big city types think you can come into our town, lie your way into meetings, and throw your weight around. But I don't care how much money you have, Mr. Reed. Here the rules still apply. Langston turned his head slowly, meeting Grayson's gaze with a glare that could have cut steel. You're making a mistake, Sheriff. I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what you've done here. Grayson's smile didn't waver. We'll see about that. As Collins hauled Langston toward the squad car, the crowd parted, their faces a blur of confusion, pity, and, worst of all, indifference. No one stepped forward. No one spoke up. Not Mitchell, who stood frozen on the courthouse steps, his mouth moving wordlessly. Not the shopkeepers or pedestrians who watched Langston being marched down the street like a criminal. The handcuffs chafed against Langston's wrists, but it wasn't the physical discomfort that stung the most. It was the humiliation, the helplessness, the knowledge that Grayson had set this up perfectly, and Langston had walked right into it. The car door opened, and Collins shoved him into the back seat. Langston's head hit the ceiling as he stumbled, but he caught himself, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him falter. The door slammed shut, and Langston stared out the window as the squad car pulled away. The crowd outside grew smaller and smaller, but their silence lingered, heavy and damning. This is what they want, Langston thought, his chest heaving with the effort to stay calm. They want me to break, to lash out, to play into their hands. But they were going to be disappointed. As the car rumbled toward the sheriff's station, Langston's mind was already working. He wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. Grayson wanted to drag him down, to humiliate him, to make him feel powerless. But Langston Reed didn't lose. Not here. Not like this. Langston sat in the holding cell, the cold metal bench pressing uncomfortably against his back. The air was stale, heavy with the faint scent of bleach and desperation. The dim light flickered overhead, as if even the fixtures in this place were tired of fighting against the darkness. He hadn't been formally charged with anything. That much was clear. Grayson didn't have a case, just intimidation tactics and lies. But that didn't matter. Grayson wasn't playing by the rules. He was playing to humiliate, to send a message. Men like you don't belong here. Langston leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his mind sharp and unrelenting. He thought of his father's words, spoken to him long ago when he was just a boy. When they come for you, don't shout, don't fight, stand firm, and make them hear you. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, heavy, deliberate. The lock on the cell door clanged, and in walked Sheriff Grayson, his boots scraping the floor like nails on glass. He was alone this time. No Deputy Collins, no witnesses, just him and Langston. Grayson's face twisted into a smirk as he leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Well, you're quiet all of a sudden, Mr. Reed. Not so big and confident now, are you?" Langston looked up slowly, meeting his gaze. "Is that what this is about? Making me small?" Grayson's smirk widened. "It's about keeping order, Mr. Reed. You come into my town, flashing your money, acting like you own the place. Folks around here don't take kindly to that." Langston stood, slowly, deliberately. He was taller than Grayson by a few inches, and as he took a step forward, the sheriff's shoulders stiffened slightly. An imperceptible shift, but Langston noticed. He smiled faintly. "You mean folks like Earl and his crew?" Langston asked, his voice calm but edged with steel. "They're the ones you're protecting, aren't they? Men who look like you, who think like you. You're scared of anyone who doesn't fall in line." Grayson's eyes darkened, his smirk faltering for the first time. "Watch yourself?" "No," Langston said, his voice rising slightly. "You watch yourself, Sheriff. You arrested me on a lie, dragged me into a room like a criminal, because a few of your buddies got nervous seeing a black man drinking coffee in their diner. And you know what makes you pathetic? You don't even care if it's true. All you care about is keeping men like me in check. Isn't that right?" Grayson's face flushed red. He took a step closer, his voice dropping into a low growl. "You think you can come in here and talk to me like that? You don't know who you're dealing with, boy." Langston's pulse quickened at the word, but his expression remained steady. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. A small-town tyrant with too much power and too little integrity, a man who's scared of losing control." Grayson's lip curled, his hands twitching at his sides. For a moment, Langston wondered if the sheriff might strike him, but Grayson held back, clearly aware of the risks. "You think you're so damn smart," Grayson sneered. "You don't belong here, Reed. You and your big city arrogance, you think money makes you untouchable, but it doesn't mean a damn thing in my town." Langston took another step forward, his voice low and deliberate. "This isn't your town. It belongs to the people, to the kids I'm trying to help, and whether you like it or not, I'm not leaving quietly." Grayson laughed bitterly, though there was no humor in it. "You're a fool. People here don't care about your programs, your speeches, or your handouts. They'll take one look at you and listen to me, because I'm the one they trust you. You're just another outsider, and when I'm done with you, you'll wish you'd never set foot here." Langston's fists clenched, the rage surging through him like a current. For years, he'd fought men like Grayson, men who built their power on fear and ignorance, and for years he'd chosen to rise above it, to fight with words and deeds instead of fists. But now, standing face to face with a man so steeped in his own hatred, Langston felt the pull of something primal. But then, he remembered who he was. He took a steady breath, forcing his hands to relax. "You want to ruin me, Sheriff?" Langston said, his voice calm again. "Go ahead. But know this. You're not as untouchable as you think you are. I've got resources, connections. When I leave here, every paper from Atlanta to Millbrook will know exactly what happened. Your little story. It won't hold up, and when people start digging into how you've been running this town, you'll wish you'd left me alone." Grayson's smile faltered completely this time. For the first time since the diner, the sheriff looked unsure of himself, as if Langston had struck a nerve. "You're bluffing." "Try me," Langston said. "I've spent my life building something bigger than you can imagine. I'm not a man you can intimidate, and I'm not a man you can silence. So you go ahead and push me, Sheriff. Let's see what happens when the spotlight lands on you." Grayson's jaw worked, his teeth grinding audibly. For a long moment, the two men stood in silence, the tension in the room thick enough to choke on. Finally, Grayson stepped back, his expression twisted with fury and frustration. "You're playing a dangerous game, Reed. You don't know how far I'm willing to go. And you don't know how far I'll push back," Langston shot back. Grayson sneered one last time before turning on his heel and stomping out of the cell. The door slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the room like a gunshot. Langston sank back onto the bench, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He'd stood his ground, but he wasn't naive. Grayson wasn't done with him. Men like that never stopped until they were forced to. The sound of voices carried down the hall, muffled but growing louder. Langston turned toward the cell door just as it opened again, and Mitchell appeared, his face pale and drawn. "Langston!" Mitchell rushed inside, his voice hushed but urgent. "I just got a call from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. They want a statement. Did you—" Langston met his gaze, his expression unwavering. "I didn't call them, but someone did." Mitchell hesitated, his eyes wide. "Grayson's furious. He's saying you resisted arrest, that you threatened him. He's trying to make this look like your fault." Langston nodded slowly, his mind racing. "Then it's time we show the truth." Mitchell frowned. "What do you mean?" Langston stood, his shoulders straightening. "I need you to get me a phone, and I need you to bring a reporter here now." Mitchell paled. "Langston, that's going to blow this up. Are you sure?" "Blowing it up is the only way," Langston said firmly. "Grayson wants to silence me. I'm going to make sure everyone hears what he's done. I don't care how ugly it gets." Mitchell swallowed hard, clearly torn. But then he nodded. "I'll make the call." As Mitchell hurried out of the room, Langston sat back down, his resolve hardening like iron. He'd been backed into a corner before, but this time was different. This time, he was ready to fight, not just for himself, but for the people Grayson and his kind had been stepping on for years. It wasn't just about Millbrook anymore. It was about something bigger. Langston stared at the door, his fists clenched. Whatever happened next, he wouldn't back down. Let Grayson come for him. Langston Reed would be ready. Langston directly confronts Grayson, exposing his corruption while preparing to escalate the conflict with a public revelation. The stakes are higher than ever, with Langston's next move poised to change everything. The interrogation room was suffocating, its windowless walls closing in on Langston like a cage. Grayson had left him stewing for nearly an hour. But Langston wasn't rattled. Every passing minute allowed him to sharpen his resolve, to prepare for the inevitable storm. When the door finally slammed open, Sheriff Grayson entered with slow, deliberate steps, dragging the moment out like a predator savoring its prey. Behind him trailed Deputy Collins, holding a thick manila folder that Langston knew had been prepared just for show. "You're still sitting pretty," Grayson said with a grin that reeked of malice, his voice dripping with feigned civility. "I'd think someone in your position might be sweating a little more by now." Langston met his gaze with a steady calm that cut through the room's tension like a knife. "I don't sweat for bullies." Grayson's grin twitched, but he kept his composure, circling Langston like a wolf closing in. "Bullies? Is that what you think this is, Mr. Reed?" He chuckled, though the sound carried no humor. "See, I think you're misunderstanding the situation here. You're not in one of your big city boardrooms anymore, talking circles around people. You're in my town, where things work a little differently." Langston remained seated, his fingers interlaced on the table, as he watched Grayson perform. "You keep calling it your town, but it's not, Sheriff. It belongs to the people. The only power you have is the power they let you have." Grayson's smile vanished. He slammed his hands on the table, the sharp crack echoing off the walls. Collins flinched but said nothing, his gaze darting nervously between them. "That's where you're wrong," Grayson growled, his face inches from Langston's. "Men like you think you can walk in here and change things. You throw around your money, talk big about programs and opportunities, like you're saving us from something, but we don't need saving." Langston didn't flinch, though his heart hammered in his chest. "You mean you don't need saving? But what about the people you're supposed to serve? The kids who don't get a chance, because you've spent years protecting men like Earl and crushing anyone who doesn't look like you." Grayson's face reddened, his jaw clenching hard. "You watch your mouth." "Or what?" Langston said, standing suddenly, his height forcing Grayson to take a step back. "You'll arrest me again on what charge? Being successful while black bringing opportunities to a town you've been strangling for decades?" Grayson faltered for a moment, but Langston pressed on, his voice rising with unrelenting force. "You're a coward, Grayson. You keep your people down because you're afraid of what happens when they realize they don't need you. You let men like Earl poison this town with their hatred because it keeps you in control. But I see you for what you are, a scared little man hiding behind a badge." Grayson's hand twitched toward his belt, a reflex maybe, or an empty threat. But the accusation cut deep. Langston could see it in his eyes. For the first time, someone had said it out loud, stripped him bare of his illusion of power. "You're done talking," Grayson hissed through clenched teeth. "You want to fight me? Fine. Let's play. I've got something you might want to see." He motioned for Collins, who hesitated before placing the manila folder on the table and sliding it toward Langston. Grayson straightened, regaining a sliver of his arrogance. "See? We did a little digging on you, Mr. Reed. A man like you, money, power. It's easy to imagine there's skeletons in your closet." Langston stared at the folder. "Is that supposed to scare me?" Grayson smirked. "Open it." Langston didn't move. "No." Grayson blinked, caught off guard. "What?" Langston's voice remained steady. "You think you can intimidate me with fake files and fabricated scandals? You're desperate, Grayson, and it's showing. I don't need to look inside that folder to know you're bluffing." Collins shifted uncomfortably beside the sheriff. It was clear he hadn't been fully briefed on whatever Grayson was attempting. Langston didn't miss the deputy's hesitation, the flicker of doubt behind his eyes. Grayson's confidence cracked further. "You're arrogant. You think you're untouchable." Langston took a step closer, his tone deliberate and razor-sharp. "I'm not untouchable, Sheriff, but you've made one critical mistake. You underestimated me. You thought you could drag me in here, humiliate me, and send me packing. But all you've done is give me exactly what I need to expose you." Grayson laughed bitterly, though the sound trembled at the edges. "Expose me for what? Protecting my town, keeping troublemakers like you in check?" Langston leaned in just slightly, his voice dropping to a low, steady register. "You think no one's been watching you? That no one's noticed what you've been doing for years? Your abuse of power, your deals with men like Earl to keep certain families down, while others thrive. You're not as invisible as you think, Grayson. And I've made sure that everything you've done gets brought to light." Grayson's eyes narrowed, the smugness bleeding out of him completely. "You're bluffing." "Try me," Langston replied without hesitation. "My team has already started gathering statements from families you've pushed around, from businesses you've intimidated, and yes, from Earl. Do you think men like him will stand by you when the fire gets too hot?" Grayson faltered, the confidence finally crumbling under the weight of Langston's words. Langston had seen that look before, the realization of a man cornered, desperate, and running out of options. "You're done, Grayson," Langston said firmly. "This ends today. Either you step down quietly, or I'll make sure the entire state knows who you are and what you've done. The choice is yours." The silence that followed was heavy. Grayson's chest heaved as he stared at Langston. His fists clenching and unclenching at his sides, Collins stood frozen, clearly torn between loyalty and the reality of what was unfolding before him. "You don't get to come in here and take this from me," Grayson said, his voice hoarse. "This town is mine." Langston shook his head slowly. "Not anymore." The words hung in the air like a gavel's final strike. Grayson opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the door burst open. Mitchell Carter stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 state police officers. His face was tight, his expression unreadable. "Sheriff Grayson," Mitchell said, his voice cool and firm. "I think it's time you came with us." Grayson whirled around, his face contorted in disbelief. "What the hell is this?" "The beginning of the end," Mitchell replied. He nodded toward the state officers, who stepped forward. Grayson sputtered, pointing an accusatory finger at Langston. "You! This is your doing!" Langston didn't say a word. He simply stared back, his silence louder than anything he could have said. The state officers grabbed Grayson by the arms, and despite his protests, they began to haul him out of the room. Collins stayed where he was, his face pale and stricken, his loyalty to Grayson evaporating like mist. Langston let out a slow breath as the door swung shut, the weight of the moment settling over him. Mitchell stepped forward, his face full of apology. "Langston, Langston held up a hand. "Not now, Mitchell, we're not finished." Mitchell frowned. "What do you mean?" Langston turned toward the table, his voice calm but resolute. "We've started something here, but there's more work to do for the town, for the people Grayson's hurt. This doesn't end with him being hauled out of here." Mitchell nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. Langston's gaze hardened. "It ends when the system that let him thrive is torn down piece by piece. Sheriff Grayson's corruption has been exposed, and he's removed from his position, but Langston knows the fight isn't over. The system that enabled Grayson must still be dismantled, Setting up the final resolution, Langston stood on the steps of Millbrook's courthouse, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the square. For the first time since his arrival, the air felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted, not just from his shoulders, but from the town itself. Sheriff Grayson was gone, hauled off in the back of a state patrol car, his face pale and stunned as his world crumbled around him. News traveled quickly in towns like Millbrook. By now, half the community knew what had happened. The sheriff arrested, his years of corruption finally dragged into the light. Grayson's carefully crafted facade had shattered, exposing the petty tyrant who had abused his power for far too long. His allies, men like Earl, had scattered, unwilling to defend someone they knew could bring them down with him. Langston looked out over the square. People were beginning to gather. Shopkeepers, mothers holding their children's hands, teenagers lingering on bikes, watching as whispers turned to conversations. It wasn't just gossip, it was something more. Something that sounded like hope. Mitchell Carter approached from the courthouse doors, his suit rumpled and his expression full of a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. Langston. Langston turned, nodding once. It's done? Mitchell exhaled heavily, running a hand through his silver hair. State authorities are already combing through Grayson's records. I don't think they'll like what they find. And Earl? He shook his head. He's already singing like a bird to save his own skin. Langston allowed a small, tired smile. I figured as much. Men like him are only loyal to their own survival. Mitchell hesitated before speaking again, his voice softer. You were right about all of it. I didn't want to see it, but this town has been rotting from the inside for years. Grayson was just the start. Langston's gaze turned back toward the crowd that had gathered. A few people were looking at him now. Really looking, seeing him as more than the outsider Grayson had tried to paint him as. Then let's make sure this is the start of something better. Mitchell nodded slowly, the hint of a smile touching his lips. You're not leaving yet, are you? Langston shook his head. Not yet, I've got work to do. The next morning, the community center at Millbrook's edge was packed. Langston stood at the podium, his voice steady and clear, as he spoke to a crowd larger than he had expected. Mothers with children on their laps, teachers, business owners, and students. All of them had come, curious and hopeful about what Langston had to say. This town deserves better, Langston said, his words carrying through the room. Your children deserve opportunities. They deserve a future where they don't have to live in fear of speaking up or being seen. But that doesn't happen by accident. It happens when people decide to stop looking the other way. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room, meeting faces that, just days ago, might have avoided his. I won't promise you that change will be easy. It won't be. But I can promise you this. I'll be here to help make it happen. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Langston glanced toward the back of the room, where Mitchell stood alongside a handful of community leaders. For the first time, they weren't just nodding politely, they were listening. When Langston finished speaking, applause filled the space. It wasn't thunderous, but it was real honest. A first step. As the crowd dispersed, a teenage boy approached, clutching a worn basketball under his arm. He looked to be about 15, tall and lanky, with the kind of determination Langston recognized from his own youth. Mr. Reed? The boy said, his voice uncertain but steady. Langston crouched slightly to meet him at eye level. What's your name? Jaden, the boy replied. I just wanted to say, thanks for everything you did. My mom says people like Grayson always win, but... He glanced around the room, then back at Langston. I don't think they have to anymore. Langston's chest tightened, and he smiled. You're right, Jaden. They don't. He patted the boy's shoulder. Now, you keep pushing for what you believe in, okay? Never let anyone tell you where you do or don't belong. Jaden grinned, nodding before jogging back to join his friends, the basketball bouncing as he went. Langston stood, watching him go, his heart full. This was why he had come. Not just to fight back against Grayson, but to show the people of Millbrook that there was another way, that someone could stand up and win. By the end of the week, the headlines were everywhere. Small town sheriff exposed, corruption uncovered in Millbrook. Business leader, Langston Reed, takes a stand against systemic abuse. Justice in Millbrook, A turning point for the community. Reporters swarmed, eager to cover the story, and Langston gave his statements carefully. He didn't dwell on himself. He spoke about Millbrook, about the families who had been silenced for too long, about the changes that needed to happen. Not just here, but everywhere. Sheriff Grayson's resignation was announced within days, though it wasn't much of a choice. The state investigation uncovered years of abuses, unjust arrests, backroom deals, selective enforcement of laws to protect Grayson's inner circle. Earl, predictably, turned informant, exposing more of the sheriff's network. As Langston predicted, the system had started to crumble under its own weight. On Langston's last day in Millbrook, he sat alone on the courthouse steps, the same ones where Grayson had once tried to humiliate him. The square was quiet now, the air still, as though the town itself was taking a breath after weeks of turmoil. "Thought I'd find you here." Langston turned to see Mitchell approaching, his hands stuffed in his coat pockets. "You heading out soon?" Mitchell asked, stopping a few steps below him. Langston nodded. "Yeah, my team's already got the ball rolling on the youth program. I'll be back to check in, but I think it's time for the people here to take the next steps themselves." Mitchell smiled faintly. "You know, you could have walked away, left town after Grayson arrested you. Most people would have." Langston met his gaze. "Most people don't get that choice, Mitchell. That's what I'm fighting for. So they do." Mitchell nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You made a lot of enemies here, but I think you've made some friends too." Langston stood, brushing the dust from his pants. "Enemies are easy. Friends are harder. I'll take the hard road." Mitchell extended his hand, and Langston took it, their grips firm and resolute. "You've done something good here, Langston," Mitchell said. "I hope you know that." Langston smiled. "We've only just started." As he walked to his car, Langston turned back for one last look at Millbrook. The courthouse loomed behind him, but it didn't feel oppressive anymore. The town square, once a place of judgment and humiliation, now felt like the beginning of something new. The road ahead was long, and Langston knew the fight wasn't over. Change was slow, and resistance would come. But for the first time, Millbrook's foundation had cracked, and light was seeping through. Langston got into his car and started the engine, his mind already moving forward. He thought of Jaden, of the mothers in the crowd, of the kids who would grow up in a town that looked a little different than the one before. And as he drove out of Millbrook, Langston smiled. This was just the beginning. Langston Reed sat in his corner office in Atlanta, the morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city skyline stretched endlessly before him, a reflection of the life he had built with his own two hands. He turned his chair slightly, staring at the framed photo sitting at the edge of his desk, a snapshot of the community center in Millbrook, taken just days ago, filled with children smiling as they played basketball and parents gathered in conversation. A small caption at the bottom read, "For a better tomorrow." Langston picked up the frame, turning it over in his hands. It wasn't just a photo. It was a symbol proof that sometimes, even in places steeped in resistance and stagnation, change could take root. He leaned back, the chair creaking under him, and let himself pause. It had been weeks since he left Millbrook, yet the memories still lingered. Sheriff Grayson's smug face as he tried to break him, the weight of the handcuffs biting into his wrists, and the silence of the crowd as he was paraded through the square. But what stuck with him most was what came after. The courage that began to blossom in a town that had been shackled by fear for so long. Millbrook had been more than just a fight with one man. It had been a reflection of a system that remained alive and well in far too many places. A system that thrived in the shadows, fueled by silence, complicity, and fear. Langston had spent his life navigating those shadows, knowing how quickly power could be weaponized against men like him. But Millbrook had reminded him of something important. Resilience didn't come from shouting the loudest. It came from standing your ground when everything else tried to push you back. The phone on his desk buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. Mitchell Carter. Langston smiled faintly and picked up the call. "Mitchell." "Langston." Mitchell's voice carried a mixture of excitement and exhaustion. "I thought you'd want to hear the news. The state finalized their investigation into Grayson this morning. He's looking at 5 years minimum for obstruction, abuse of power, and a whole list of other charges." Langston exhaled slowly, letting the weight of it settle over him. Good, it's about time. It's more than just Grayson, Mitchell continued. Some of his supporters are being investigated too. Earl and his crew included. It's like the whole foundation's coming apart. People are talking, it's uncomfortable for some of them, but it's progress. Progress. Langston let the word hang in the air. It was what he'd hoped for, even if he knew the fight was far from over. What about the mentorship program? Langston asked. That's why I'm calling, Mitchell said, his tone brightening. We launched it yesterday, and you should have seen the turnout, parents, teachers, students. It was incredible. Jaden gave a speech. You know, that kid's got fire in him. He talked about you, how you showed him that standing up for what's right matters, even when it's hard. Langston felt something tighten in his chest, a mix of pride, humility, and determination. Jaden's face flashed in his mind, that spark of hope in his eyes. That was the real victory. I'm glad to hear it, Langston said, his voice softer. The kids need this. Mitchell hesitated before continuing, his tone more reflective. Langston, I have to admit, I wasn't sure you'd stick it out in Millbrook. I thought you'd take your beating and leave like everyone else who's tried to challenge the way things work here, but you didn't. Because I couldn't, Langston replied simply. If I walked away, what would that teach Jaden, or anyone else watching? They needed to see someone stand up and not back down. Mitchell let out a small laugh. Well, you've done more than stand up. You lit a fire under this place. It's not perfect, not yet, but people are looking at things differently, talking differently, and that's because of you. Langston nodded, even though Mitchell couldn't see him. Change doesn't happen overnight, but as long as people are talking, as long as they're seeing what's broken, we've already won part of the battle. Are you sure you won't come back to see it yourself? Mitchell asked. Langston smiled faintly. I will in time, but Millbrook doesn't need me to hold its hand. The people there have the strength to do the hard work now. My job was just to remind them of that. They said their goodbyes, and Langston set the phone down, his mind still turning over Mitchell's words. You lit a fire. It didn't feel like enough, not yet, but fires had a way of spreading. That evening, Langston stood on the balcony of his home, the city lights glittering like 1,000 stars spread across the earth. Atlanta was his base, his foundation, but Millbrook had become something more, something personal. He thought of Sheriff Grayson, of how quickly men like him had been able to twist truth into lies. It wasn't just Millbrook, it was everywhere. Small towns, big cities, back roads, and bustling streets. The system Grayson represented was alive, but it was vulnerable too, when people like Langston refused to play by its rules. He had seen how deep the rot ran, but he had also seen something else. Hope. Jaden's determination. Mitchell's eventual courage. May's small kindness. The faces in the community center. People who had spent so long keeping their heads down finally looking up. It would be easy to focus only on the victories, but Langston knew better. There was more work to do. Grayson had fallen, but the system that enabled him would remain unless more people stood up, more people pushed back. Langston had been a spark in Millbrook, but he couldn't be everywhere. The real power lay in the people willing to fight for their own communities, no matter how hard it got. His phone buzzed with a new message. It was from one of his team members working on a similar program in another state. Langston's smile was small, but resolute. This wasn't the end. It was just another step forward. He turned back toward the city, the breeze lifting the edges of his blazer. His father's words echoed in his mind, words that had carried him through every battle. When they come for you, don't shout, don't fight, stand firm, and make them hear you. Langston had done just that. Not just for himself, but for Jaden, for the families in Millbrook, and for every small-town kid who'd ever been told they couldn't. The world wouldn't change overnight. He knew that. But change was possible, and it started with moments like these. Moments where someone decided to stand firm and speak up. Langston turned toward the door, his steps steady and sure. Tomorrow, there would be more calls to take, more programs to launch, more people to help. He was ready, because the fire had started, and it wasn't going out anytime soon. Langston Reed's journey in Millbrook reflects the larger fight against systemic racism and abuse of power, showing that real change begins when someone refuses to back down. His resilience inspires a community to confront its truths, take ownership of its future, and believe that progress is possible. The story ends on a note of hope and determination, emphasizing that while challenges remain, every action, every stand taken, lights the way for others. Langston's fight isn't over, but he has proven that no system is unshakable, and even the smallest town can change when people decide to rise together.